From Colorado, Mr. Buck.
And with the chairman's permission, I defer to Mr. Gaetz from Florida.
Mr. Gaetz is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is my favorite subcommittee in my half-decade in Congress, and in no small part because of the way you've led it. I am incredibly proud of the work we have done to address some of these anti-competitive practices of these monopolistic entities. And I was particularly persuaded by the testimony of Mr. Gross regarding how that market power of big businesses like Amazon can limit the ability of workers to have any type of meaningful negotiation. Congresswoman Jayapal led legislation that the chairman of the committee, the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Buck, and myself supported that would force the breakup of companies like Amazon into smaller entities. And I wanted Mr. Gross's perspective on that. Do you believe, as a negotiator, that would improve the position of workers to break up companies like Amazon and other big tech companies into smaller entities?
Well, I'm not an expert on this field. You know, obviously I'm just a driver at UPS and a shop steward for my union. But what I would say though is that it might not necessarily be necessary to break up the size of the company, but just to allow or force the company or encourage the company to employ the workers that it's utilizing. So instead of using third-party individuals and leaning on them and chewing them up and spitting them out, have real employees, you know, give them real wages, allow them to have a collective bargaining unit agreement. And I think that way you would get more productivity out of them in the long run and still be able to run a successful business.
I appreciate that perspective. My concern is that if they're able to stay so big, even if we used the awesome powers of the federal government to force these relationships out of independent contractor relationships into employment relationships, they're still so big that they could reduce the contributions of those employees with the strength that they have. And it is one of the reasons why we had bipartisan support on this committee for those bills. But Mr. Chairman, I'm deeply disappointed that those bills haven't been called up for a vote. It seems a bit odd to be here talking about positive impacts of legislation the subcommittee has passed when the full House has had the opportunity in prior weeks to take up these bills and they haven't. And I have to wonder why that has happened. And so, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a piece from the New York Times entitled "Tech Giants Fearful of Proposals to Curb Them, Blitz Washington with Lobbying."
Without objection.
And so that could be a reason, the power of lobbyists in this town to make things tougher for workers. I guess there could be other reasons too. Mr. Chairman, I would seek to enter into the record a piece from Yahoo News entitled "Tim Cook Reportedly Called Pelosi to Deliver a Warning About Congress's Antitrust Bills."
Without objection.
So maybe it's the lobbyists, maybe it's the power of these very powerful CEOs making personal calls, but it could even be something more sinister. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a Fortune.com piece entitled "Speaker Nancy Pelosi's Husband Cashed in on Big Tech Just as Congress was set to pounce."
Without objection.
And in that article, there's discussion of the spouse of the Speaker of the House making a $6 million call on stocks that netted $5.3 million while we're not moving these bills. So I thought that was a little odd. I thought that was weird. We moved bipartisan legislation out of this subcommittee, and just as we're considering it, and it might be bad for big tech, the Speaker's spouse goes and buys all this big tech stock, and then lo and behold, here we are with the bills not called up. And it just makes you wonder, did somebody know something? Was somebody acting on information? And it could have been the power of the lobbyists and all the money that they donate to members of Congress on both sides. It could have been people like Tim Cook calling, but here's what we know. These bills aren't coming to the floor. If they were coming to the floor, they would have been on the floor in prior weeks. And so now we sit here with this great work likely extinguished in its tracks for one of these unfortunate reasons. And Mr. Chairman, I know we've got Chairman Nadler's MORE Act coming up soon. And one thing we learned in the marijuana movement is sometimes you got to lose votes on the floor. Sometimes you got to put up the votes, you got to lose, and then year after year, you make a little progress, you get further down the road. And even if these tech bills can't pass, I would encourage you to talk to the speaker and put them up for a vote. And I know she said she won't put up votes that don't pass, but if it could at least give us a measuring tool to be able to come back and work to persuade our other members. I thank the chairman for his indulgence for going over time, and I yield back.
And I want to reassure the gentleman that I am working very closely with the ranking member of the subcommittee to be sure that our colleagues who have not had the benefit of the 16-month study that we conducted, where we, I think, learned a lot about this marketplace, understood what these complicated bills do. We want to be sure that our colleagues are fully briefed up, and we are committed to making certain these bills come to the floor, not just for a vote, but for a vote that prevails because of the hard work that's been done, and we are grateful for your ongoing and strong support. But this is an important priority for me, I know for all the Democrats in our caucus, and certainly for the chair of the full Judiciary Committee, and working very closely with Mr. Buck to be sure we get to that point. And thank you again for your support of our investigation and the legislation. And with that, I now go to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.